guess we'll get started. Hi everyone, my name is Kellyanne Stanley. I am the Public Programs Officer here at FCMG. I'd like to welcome you all to today's online Curator and Artists Talks with Sarah Rose and half, I guess, of the In the Fibre for Being artists. Before we jump straight to it, and I'll hand over to Sarah, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. FCMG is situated on Darug land, the capital clan of the Darug Nation, and I'd love to invite everyone to actually change their usernames if they'd like to acknowledge the country that they're on today. Thank you all for coming. I know it's during the day for today's talk, but it's going to be fantastic. Today we have, I don't know how many artists in total. I think we've got 6 or 5 artists today to talk a little bit about their work. But I will now pass on the baton to Sarah, the curator of the show, to talk a little bit about the exhibition and her curatorial amazingness. And yeah, Sarah, if you want to take it away, go for it.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today as we talk about In the Fibre for Being, a show that I've recently curated, and all of the artists here today. Thank you so much for joining us, and they'll talk a little bit about their works. So a little bit about myself is I'm a Sydney-based early career curator, not an artist, a curator, and I often engage with themes surrounding the body as both a material and subject, and really engaging with research around the notions of trace and embodied materiality. And that's where I kind of found an interest in fibre due to those qualities that it has to really hold and activate memories within its actual material. I also often look at the experiences of women more specifically, which this show really does embody due to the all-female lineup that we have. A little bit of context about the exhibition. In the Fibre for Being really contemplates the role of women as anonymous carriers and purveyors of heritage and intersecting diverse cultures, geographies, temporalities, and languages, and really looks at that intergenerational continuity through the transference of knowledge and the sharing of narratives between women and that matrilineal heritage. And it's acutely linked to the preservation of customary practices, connectivity, and belonging. All of the artists in the show really use fibre as their dialect to communicate their personal as well as their collective histories, and those legacies surrounding womanhood, female subjectivity, diaspora resilience, healing, as well as community. And all of these women are, through their works, part of another community beyond the ones they probably recognize. So, and it really engages with textiles as a language, which is enmeshed and underpinning the exhibition as they use fibre to navigate their gendered lineages and their cultural and hybridized identities, and through that, their extension of how they view themselves and their being within, the larger ecology of our existence. And I think coming back to language, and that's where this show kind of stems from, there's been a long history between textiles and language, not through its linguistic traditions, more specifically, but think of phrases like spinning a yarn, or even like fabricate stories or plotting threads. There's actually a origin with the word text and textiles, which comes from the Latin meaning of to weave. So there's kind of a very deep and embodied history there. And I think very poignantly and important to the show's themes is this notion that fibre operates as a silent witness to the rhythms and routines of our daily lives and that everydayness. And it kind of mediates this relationship between ourselves, the world, others, comes through with a lot of the work. So a lot of the stories and narratives that are shared are quite personal, and I really enjoyed working with all of these women and bringing this show together. Their stories. It was such a great collaboration. I think I really want to kind of also bring it back to the history of where textiles comes from, more specifically, and how it has been relegated as women's work throughout history. And I think that's where a lot of these women have really challenged that and have taken this medium as their own and have transformed it in a very contemporary context. And I think we often associate textiles as something that is, found in the kitchen or our bedrooms or, in those more domestic spaces and kind of within that household economy. So I'd really like to pass it on to Monica, who's going to talk a little bit more about that domestic kind of relationship with her work lineage. So Monica, would you like to speak a little bit about your work and your practice and process?
Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for this opportunity to say more about my work. Lineage was produced as part of my body of work during my honours year, which was last year. And I guess it's a part of a year-long exploration of my motivation and my, I guess, sensibility to materials. And it was when I once again rediscovered, I guess, that I'm mostly drawn to textiles and thread, although while I was mostly studying painting, I always felt drawn to textiles, but I guess last year was a really intense exploration, which enabled me to, articulate why possibly that is. And so I did a lot of experimentation, and lineage is one of the works I did last year, and it primarily communicates my creative relationship to my female ancestors, primarily my mom and my two grandmothers, who all practiced some kind of craft. And also, I guess the work being made and thought about last year was an attempt of creating a connection again, I guess materializing the connection that was there, that still is there, but it's changing and evolving, and unfortunately perhaps also disappearing, since my family is overseas in Croatia, and I was planning to go and visit them last year, and I was also hoping to source some materials, some personal textiles, but that was not possible. So my work that was made last year was also kind of coming to terms with what was happening as well, and trying to materialize this connection that I still feel, and that I also want to, I guess, explain and articulate to myself, and also kind of hopes to communicate some aspects of some disagreeable aspects of patriarchal context of my upbringing. So I guess the work tries to do yes, what I just said, using textiles and considering textiles as like Sarah just said, silent witnesses and a language. Yeah. um,
Great. Thank you so much for sharing the underpinnings of your work. And I think you can kind of see that real gestural vulnerability within each of the strokes you've made on the fibre, as well as, you know, these kind of embroidered areas. Did you want to go into a bit more about the actual methodology that you've used and how this gridded format is actually not in line with what would usually be taught to women?
yes, I guess the decisions I made in terms of both thread and acrylic paint were made based on the nature of the fabric that I decided to use, as it reminded me of curtains that they all used to have in their homes. My mom and both grandmas, I think it was very much like that, something curtains, and I was amazed how that was one of the materials that I worked with that was mostly that I kind of had maybe the most vivid reaction to, that it kind of brought up some memories, and yeah, those homes, I guess, that I spent a lot of time in. And I guess I made the decision to yes, just use the black thread and just to play with lines and just with the tension between continuity and discontinuity, and just doing repetitive lines in all directions, and accepting knots and mistakes intentionally as part of wanting to communicate my departure from the rules of embroidery, because I was taught to do it properly, and that's mostly decorative. And so I intentionally did it this way. Same or similar is, yeah, it's, I guess the use of paint was also motivated by just me trying to kind of evoke those spaces, the windows where curtains like this one used to hang. So I used the paint that kind of evokes the feel of the timber windows, and I guess, yeah, just expressive marks were just kind of trying to, I guess, capture those emotions I harbor around thinking about both places and my childhood there. And so yeah, I guess marks were driven by the nature of the material mostly.
Great, thank you. And I think that kind of transmission of personal intergenerational memory embodied in materials fibers is very evident throughout a lot of the works in the exhibition. And I think it comes from this space of where like memory and knowledge kind of really like integrate and kind of really layer themselves within these textiles that kind of hold on to that and kind of store it for us. And it kind of also has this notion of sharedness, or even things that can be inherited, as you've mentioned with your grandmothers. And I think that kind of really embodies a lot of what this show is. It's looking at how a lot of that intergenerational knowledge can be passed on and activated. And I think this is where I kind of want to introduce our next artist, who is Linda, who really looks at this notion of material and fiber being able to kind of, I don't know how I'm going to like hold and communicate the stories that are already embedded within its fibers, and kind of are drawn forth by the artist to kind of share the history that's already there, but also to engage with it and add on to your own stories and narratives and experiences. Also acknowledging that often when you use repurposed materials, there is this kind of sense that you are inheriting something, and this can, be positive, and it can also have trauma attached to it, which I think is something that Linda definitely navigates within her practice. But also looking at fiber and material as a way of nurturing and healing as well. So Linda, would you like to talk a little bit more about your work, Mending Fragments of a Memory, which was a new commission for the exhibition?
Yes, hi. So the work is called Mending Fragments of a Memory, and it was actually created when I was overseas. I'm still overseas at the moment. I'm calling in from New York, so just bear with the lighting. It's a little bit different, but the work was created sort of as a way to connect with my aunt and my grandmother. I do see it as a collaboration between me and them, like sort of coming together. So the works are, the fabrics that I've used are fabrics that my aunt and grandmother on my father's side had sewn together. And my aunt used to work in a fabric sort of factory, and she would bring home these textiles, and instead of throwing them out and like being wasteful, as part of like a migrant family, I think the mentality that my family had was to just collect and to keep and to store everything, and just in case they would come in handy in sometime in the future, and together to sort of try to create blankets or quilts, bed sheets, pieces of clothing, and they'd sewn so many pieces together, but then ended up and they'd been abandoned for, I don't know, maybe like 10 years or so, and like would move from one house to the other, and I think they'd like move them along, packed in a bag from one house to the other. And so I decided to rework and utilize the fabrics to create an art installation. And as I was working with the materials, I thought having conversations with my grandmother would be important. Sort of, I guess, make that connection with like my culture. And obviously there's like a lot of history that gets embedded when you're like working with materials, especially working hands-on with material. And so I had conversations with my grandmother on my mother's side, with my mum there as well, and talked about her experiences of escaping the Khmer Rouge regime, which was a genocidal regime that occurred in Cambodia in the 1970s. And I recorded that conversation, and it was all in Khmer. So my mum was helping me to do a lot of like the translating, and it was kind of like this intergenerational unpacking of the story of how, well, some of the stories of how she escaped the Khmer Rouge. And that unpacking of my family's history is something that I've explored throughout my work, but it's always been like a really slow process. And I've always like tried to really carefully navigate it, but it's always been like a real struggle. And I guess that's why I called the work Mending Fragments of a Memory, because it's always fragmented. Like every story that I get, it's like super broken, and because I don't know a lot of Khmer either, there's like a language barrier as well. And what I initially did to the fabrics a number of years ago was I painted Khmer text onto the fabric. So I was transcribing the conversation that I had. But when Sarah approached me with the idea of like doing a commission for the show, I really wanted to rework the work further because I felt like there was just so much more I could do with it. And so I started to sew on these golden trinkets into it. And that was like my own sort of way of offering my own story. And the way, I guess it was used as a way of like gilding the piece, like offering a sort of sense of importance to the fabrics that were created. And I covered a lot of the paint and the text that was previously there. So they become these like hidden secrets that I know the story. My grandmother and my mum knows the story, but they're kind of hidden behind all this gold and like shiny like flowers and different types of flowers, like different shapes, different like textures and things. And I guess the idea of like the golden trinket was inspired by a story that I think my mum had told me of how my grandmother escaped. Was she sewed gold jewelry into her clothing and she managed to escape with it. And one of the pieces of jewelry she gifted to me when I was a child, and I used to wear it and buy it onto it as like a little as something I would do to comfort myself. And so I've used a lot of that same like idea of the necklace to prop the artwork up, and like wherever there's like a gap in the fabric, I've used it to tie it all together. So it's almost like this way of like this way of like mending, but in a very like visible way, rather than like hiding the scars of the cuts I've made. It's like a visible patching over. And yeah, I think the work overall is like, it was a really great bridge between like, especially because I was working on the pieces from so far away, like a way of me connecting to my aunt and my grandmother and my family just in general, because I was working with these fabrics that I was looking at for so long back at home. And now I'm looking at them from New York, and they're like the same fabrics, but they have like so much of the gestures and the action, sewing the pieces together. You know, there was like machine sewing in there as well as hand sewn pieces. So there was a real it felt like really that they had left behind, and like my me like continuing how I was able to continue those gestures that they were making. And it was a way, I guess, because language was always something that I struggled with, and not being able to connect to them through a language. This material became a language where we could connect. And I'm hoping to continue this project as well, because there's lots more fabrics that they have still at home in plastic bags somewhere. So hopefully I can like expand it further as well down the track.
Great. Did you want to expand a little bit more on the significance of gold within your practice and how it relates to this work a little bit further?
Yeah, I guess I always saw gold adorned on things when I was growing up, especially going to temple and seeing like the very kind of gaudy, but like very bold statues that would be like gilded in gold. And it was always something that I thought was like really shiny, beautiful, and a way of like softening, especially when you're talking about something like trauma, a way of like softening the message that's behind the work. And a material that I was working with quite a lot, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, was joss paper. And the piece of joss paper is a way to give an offering to a past ancestor. So usually the joss paper would be burnt, and the essence of it would like go on to help our ancestors in the afterlife. And I see, and on the joss paper there would be this gold leaf, like an imitation gold leaf that was put on top of it. And so that idea of an offering became really central in my work, I guess, because of the fact that so many lives were taken away during the genocidal regime. And I was often making like memorial spaces and providing spaces for, I guess, surviving generations and like forthcoming generations to heal from the trauma that occurred as well, and providing a way forward, essentially, as opposed to, because like Cambodia's story, I think, is very centralized around its trauma. And so I've really tried to find a way to create spaces that are healing spaces, as opposed to ones that are like just focused solely on the trauma that the country has struggled with.
Great, thank you. It's a gorgeous work. I'm actually currently sitting in front of it. You might be able to see. So I kind of want to jump to our next artist, Julie Gutman, next, because I think you also engage with that notion of repurposed fabrics and activating them in a new way. So would you like to speak about the work we commissioned you for this exhibition, The Black Jeans? Julie, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I think in my practice more broadly, I'm really interested in sort of layering stories together and being able to kind of draw together a lot of narratives in one kind of singular object or experience. And I think working with textiles that are given to me by my community allows me to incorporate that layer of storytelling alongside kind of the pictorial and compositional choices that I make. So everything I use in my studio is given to me by my friends and my family. And I have these kind of, this big extensive library of stories and memories that I'm kind of drawing on. And every piece of fabric that I have and I use reminds me of someone, and often reminds me of something, because it's primarily clothes, and clothes really come through life with us. They like have that really specific kind of really specific memories attached to them. So I think lately I've also been, I guess, opening up what people are able to give me beyond just clothes, and have been using a lot of sheets and towels and tablecloths. And it really, those objects are so often familial and they're so domestic that you end up, that was in my friend's family for like 25 years. And I sat around it so many times that every time I touch it and use it, I'm kind of connecting with them and thinking about those specific moments and those specific stories. So I guess the materiality of the work, I make it, and the way that I think about it. And then I'm also trying to sort of layer together those stories with specific narratives of art history that kind of inform the images themselves. So this particular work was an appropriation of this painting called The White Skirt, which is by a modernist painter now named Balthus, who was incredibly problematic. And it's the original painting is very, very eerie, and it makes me very uncomfortable. It's also very beautiful. And I think making this work was a way of trying to navigate my response to something like that. I think that there's kind of this huge weight of trauma in art history, specifically like the experience of women who have been acting as muses for for male artists for centuries. And I'm really interested in, who those women are, how they feel about the way they've been represented, and how I'm supposed to respond or navigate this piece of them that's been left behind, which doesn't really give them much of a voice. So this specific painting is of Balthus's wife, who he met when she was 12. And he did a lot of paintings of his of the children of his staff, a lot of children who, might not have had a lot of autonomy to say no to posing for him. They're very uncomfortable, difficult works, but they're still part of our canon. And I think there's this real hesitation to sort of just not engage at all, or sort of, I guess, pretend that these works don't inform so much of our canon and the ways that we think about painting and the ways that we think about portraiture. So I've been really trying to kind of, for myself, like try and directly engage with these women and unpack what it means to be a muse. I think that word is also really interesting, in that, like, if you think about women's work and craft, always being seen as this kind of amusement for ladies. And the word amusement literally means without muses. It means that there's like this absence of like true artistic energy or spirit. So how do we like reclaim that in these processes and find the muse in these spaces? And kind of, I guess, by engaging with that painting specifically and inserting myself into that painting specifically, and making it out of all of my friends' clothes, it sort of becomes this like collective response to that dynamic, and like a way of being able to be our own muses. And kind of, I guess also like mythologically, the muses were these real badasses. Like they, the muses like pecked out the sirens' eyes with forks, and like they were experts in their fields, and like really, really highly skilled, amazing mythological characters. But the only trace of them that we still kind of have left is this passive inspiration for a man. So I guess there's a lot of layers there, but it becomes a way of being able to pull together familial stories, personal stories, my stories with these, I guess, more canonical pieces of our like collective cultural history.
Great, thank you. I have a follow-up question in regards, you mentioned that you've inserted yourself into the work. Did you want to talk a little bit more about how you represented yourself?
Yeah, so I'm wearing the outfit that I was wearing when I made the work. So it's a portrait of an artist, and I think there's something interesting about the agency of that action. Like, I'm dressed to work. I'm not dressed to be looked at. I mean, I'm being looked at working, and my face is really pissed off. The original painting is like very demure, and she kind of has this like open shirt, and she's not really looking at the audience. So I think there's definitely a play on the gaze. And I ended up using some of the outfit that I was wearing when I was making it in the work. So there's this kind of nice cyclicality there, where like I think a lot of a lot of the conversation and thinking that happens in the studio ends up in the actual object.
Great. It's interesting that you mentioned like that kind of like cyclic movement and energy, and I know some of your works does look at like fast fashion and that kind of that movement of fiber. And I think what's really interesting as well that underpins this exhibition and the idea of spiral or circular, and it kind of comes with this very physical, visceral way of how textiles is usually made. There's loops, there's links, oh my God, loops, links, and chains kind of create that idea of binding or connection. And I think that really embodies that notion of, you know, women passing this knowledge across generations, not only familial, but like gendered as well. And also this very, you know, accounted for coming together in groups of, in circular formations and coming together to actually make work and, you know, like knitting circles. And there is this kind of circular movement. And that's how I kind of want to lead into our next artists, who are Lauren and Cass Hernandez, that make up the enigma of crossing threads, who, as you can see on the screen, they really engage with that idea of the circular and this kind of like bodily work. So would you both like to speak further to your practice and how you really collaborate as sisters for this work?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for including us. We are so delighted to be a part of this show. It does feel like we've gone full circle, because this time last year, we actually learned of Cassie's special news that she actually fell pregnant for the first time with her first child, and ultimately the first grandchild in our family. Our piece, titled The Passage, is a foray into soft sculpture. We've previously went down that path earlier in 2020, but we saw this opportunity to really delve into this direction and see what we can do with taking the weaving off the standard loom and turning it into more of a dimensional duo. For those who don't know, we are sisters, Lauren and Cass, and we are incredibly close in age. We're actually 13 months apart and have been operating in our partnership for the last 6 years. And with this in mind, we've really had to come to terms with each other, our incapacities, as well as the fruits that we bring to the relationship, but also allowing the time and place to allow each other to cultivate our own creative pursuits, the way that we see the world, and, you know, also coming together to form this creative partnership and practice. I think for those who know us close, we've gone to the end and back as siblings and ventured down some uncharted territory that many siblings might not even dare to dream in their lifetime. With this in mind, we're very emotional. And, you know, emotion really drives our work. And knowing the news of Cassie's pregnancy actually sparked this pivotal shift in our relationship and our art practice. And, you know, if it takes a baby to do that, it does. But I got to say, we have not fought since November last year, which I'm incredibly proud of. But I'll pass it over to Cassie to tell you more about The Passage.
Thanks, sis. So as she mentioned, it's a soft sculpture comprised of 2 organic forms, as you see on the screen. You could figuratively symbolize them as the mother and child, or the womb and the placenta. But on a deeper layer, it's so much more than that. The passage represents a return to self. It represents life. It's the coming of one's own, or becoming of one's own with or without one another. And bringing my baby Nola into the world, I think it's a really important and special time for both Lauren and I. Like most mums, during my pregnancy, I actually felt my relationship with Lauren dramatically shift, where there was this new yearning for compassion and self-care, which in strong contrast is a total opposite to our previous pattern of dysfunction that I'm sure comes with every sibling relationship. But this newfound peace and acceptance has washed over me, and hopefully this kind of translate into the work. And falling pregnant with Nola meant that I physically and mentally had to slow down, which is harder said than done, in preparation for her birth, but also the physical symptoms of being less mobile and fatigued. So during the start of the pregnancy, I actually managed to weave separate panels and construct those crawl-like vines that are incorporated in the piece. But this was done in silo due to COVID. But towards the end of my third trimester, not only being physically larger in size, I had a bout of swelling and carpal tunnel in my hands, which meant that the doctor said, stop weaving until you give birth, which meant that I also had to step back from the labor intensive component and leave it all to Lauren. So ultimately, not only there was a shift in roles, but Lauren was now taking the lead in constructing the actual piece, in bringing it together, but also relied on her beyond the execution. So prior to the pregnancy, for people who know us, my sister and I are the yin and the yang. We are total opposites. Prior to pregnancy, my sister is a masculine go-getter energy, and I'm the feminine emotional type person. But within my pregnancy, there was a beautiful transformation where I saw her soften, and she always ensured that I was nurtured, felt comfortable, and that And on the other hand, I actually grew to become more resilient and mentally stronger, knowing that, hey, this new baby Nola is bigger than the both of us, and she's coming very soon, as you can see in that right-hand side of the artwork. So being pregnant very scary and an anxious time, and attending appointments alone and taking more strict precautions made that highly isolating period seem even more difficult. So, you know, especially bringing a baby into the world, you're promised a village, but given the LGAs, we had that support network stripped from us, which was very heartbreaking, as you can imagine. But soon enough, when the restrictions eased, I could then visit Lauren's studio, and I just remember losing my breath going up the stairs, pacing up and down the studio, feeling lightheaded, adjusting my balance when trying to, you know, adhere things to the loom, because there's this new baby giving my new center of gravity. But also, most importantly, being stopped in our tracks with the beautiful kicks and kick-ups that I felt in my room as we stood in front of the piece. So for me, I feel so grateful to say that the passage marks a milestone in our artistic practice and in our lives. And it definitely binds us together in a metaphor that although we can exist separately, during this time, I definitely needed my sister more than ever.
Yeah, and I think also, Sarah, you mentioned earlier in your intro that fibre is, you know, becomes that witness to life, and it's this ongoing, constant element that is both in our, you know, domestic and I guess fashionable setting as well. And I think during the creation of the passage, like as Cass mentioned, she was very pregnant. I had to not whip her down and go, keep on making, but it was more just like, stop what you're doing. Are you fine? I'll just do it. I'll be the one wrangling and wrestling with this piece. And I think that was also a challenge for me to ask myself, could I do this venture without her? Also at the same time, could I do this venture knowing that maybe crossing threads won't be our priority anymore because Nola will be coming to the world? And how does that feel to be not necessarily second place, but also knowing that there is a, you know, there is a being, there is a presence that is larger than both of us. And in turn, I guess I would love her more than anything else, you know? When we look at the piece, yes, they're comprised of two circular forms, but they also exist, they can also exist alone. So we have that figurative umbilical cord that links the two pieces. Now, you know, thinking in, you know, with foresight, thinking of how we're going to install this piece and bring it to the gallery, it was always intended that there'll actually be two separate pieces. And, you know, physically and logistically, you would carry them as two, and actually on site and on the day of installation, we attached the umbilical cord to the mother and child. And in essence, it somewhat resembles that, you know, we're still two separate beings. I think when people think of us as crossing threads, it's a duo, and yes, we may portray ourselves to be that way, but it's always been this ongoing and internal dialogue to own our own identity, and knowing that yes, there is a shared concept, there is shared context, there is shared upbringing. Obviously we share values and how we see the world, but also breaking it down that we are still individual people, individual women with our own priorities and our own competing values as well as we grow and change. The mother circle, you can see on the image there, it is much more ravaged, it is much more matured, there is a lot more tentacles or cords, or I like to say some craters they're unearthing across the surface. It is so irregular and organic in its form that it was more about embracing the ununiformed and to really embrace that sense of uncertainty during this whole period of knowing that a new life is going to join us, and knowing that there's COVID, not knowing that what will happen, will this be a successful birth as well. As Cassie mentioned, we do operate in silo most of the time. So we do have our own home studio. So in preparation of gathering the elements for this piece, we both wove separate panels on our sari loom. And the sari philosophy is actually a Japanese philosophy that embraces the imperfect in the perfect. And I guess you could say the wabi-sabi nature of free weaving and actually separating the human handmade touch and kind of going against the machine-made look. And with that in mind, we actually took off the reed off our loom and commenced with reedless weaving, meaning there is no warp regulation. And without having that warp regulation of having each of the warps, you know, beautifully uniformed and spaced out, it actually allows for serendipity and spontaneity, and literally the weft and warp just forms together on its own intuitively. And you never know what's going to happen next. You never know how the weft is going to fall into the warp. And, you know, symbolically that, you know, relays back to how we feel about the future at that point of time. I mean, it almost feels like a lifetime ago. When we look back at this piece, it's almost like a frozen moment of time woven on the wall. And I think, you know, one of the key creative challenges that we still, you know, continue to inventory of fibers and materials, and to see how each of us weave with them in certain ways. And I think that's where you can see the sense of personality and individuality come out in the end result. It's literally, you know, a union of crossing threads where we come together. The smaller circle, as you can see, there is less textural, but there's this, you know, more of a stronger accent of that yellow there sprawling out from that crater, otherwise known as the placenta in our words. And yes, it may represent Nola and our new baby and niece, but it also represents the new beginnings in our relationship. When I think about the time and place of the creation of this piece, it was, you know, literally mum to be, baby to be, auntie to be in my studio, and have Nola's presence there listening and witnessing us. It was like she was a fly on the wall, and someone I had to, you know, catch my breath or bite my tongue to be like, how do I respond in this situation? Can she hear me? What does it sound like to hear the conversation between two sisters? It is so unfiltered and, you know, so raw that speaking and weaving together and acting together, I feel like that's like our most vulnerable state. And, you know, it's very seldom that we get to record that or document that. And I think when it comes to the creative process, it's not really the end result that matters to both Cass and I. Like, this is just an image on a wall now for us, but it's really about what we were feeling during that time, and knowing that this growing baby, this essence, this presence was listening and, you know, privy to our most vulnerable state. That somewhat not amuses me, but I think it's a special time. And it was also a beacon of hope of the positive change to come, knowing that her essence might spark better patterns, better ways of treating each other, better ways of communication. When it comes to communication, we're both Filipino Australians, so first generation Australians to Filipino immigrants. Our family immigrated to Sydney in the 1980s, and they set themselves up here in Australia. And I think being a child of a migrant, we've had to, deal with reconciling both the Australian and Filipino way of life. And what does it actually look like? What does that mean? What do we take away from both cultures and ultimately melding our own, being the third culture? And in the Filipino culture, the matriarch is somewhat upheld. We the women, we are, the doers, the actioners, the protagonists in the family dynamic. And I could definitely say, we're the get crap done in the Hernandez family. And knowing that it's somewhat thinking, is the baby the opportunity for that future state to resolve? Could we break those generational patterns and paradigms that we've had to deal with growing up? I think both of us knowing that we have a key role in influencing the next generation, that's certainly important, but also knowing that we have to step back as well and let NOLA and let our children make up their own minds for themselves, just in turn repeating what our parents did for us. So the passage, in a sense, it is very much a moment in time for us, and I think it really looks forward to what's to come, and that the cycle is never ending, and it is cyclical in everything.
Great, thank you both so much. I think that really gave a great insight into what was happening for you both in the relationship that was occurring whilst you were making the work. And I had the opportunity to meet baby Nola the other day, and I have to say she's a cutie. And I look forward to seeing another female in the world, and hopefully an artistically inclined one as well. And she can continue making alongside you guys. So in the fibre of her being, really wants to engage with that history of, over 20,000 years of history of women using textiles as their communicative tool, as their language, conveying social messages, both, visually, silently, but also now continually, and really acknowledging this open dialogue that this exhibition allows for you to engage with the autobiography, the connectivity, everything from the passing of knowledge between family members on the maternally, but also between one another. And I've had the honor of learning from everyone here along the journey, and really looking at how generations overlap and coexist, and all of those different voices that come out of the works in the show, and acknowledging all of the women that have come before us that are currently present in those. And yeah, I think that's all I had to really say. So I don't know if anyone had any questions. So the show closes on the 12th of February next year. So please come down and have a look at it if you get the chance to. If you'd also like a copy of the catalogue to read the essay and about all of these amazing works, also let us know and we can organise that for you. Was there any other questions?
I shared a question to Lauren. I guess because I'm also a new auntie as well, so welcome to the club. But I guess your sister mentioned how you had to kind of take the reins to be able to produce the work. How did that change, or I guess, how did that affect, I guess, your dynamic or your relationship, I guess, in a kind of metaphorical kind of way, having to assist, I suppose, your collaborator, and that kind of almost new role. But how has that also affected your relationship with your sister as well? Yeah, I mean, I think you already touched on it, but I think if you could just like flesh it out, because I just find that quite interesting.
Yeah, well, congrats on being an auntie as well.
It's great.
I think
great.
it's good, eh?
Yeah, I love it. It's the best thing.
Yeah, I think with every project, you know, it's always a question of, are we going to work on this together or separately? And I think from face value, you know, people might think it's always together and collaboratively. For this project, we definitely went in together, and then with Cassie's incapacities and her carpal tunnel, it was almost just like, okay, like we've got to get this across the finishing line. The deadline is literally looming. We have to get it done. The way that I felt was almost like I am the older sister, only by 13 months. And I only say that because that title actually kind of dropped off my radar maybe 10 years ago. And I'm literally, you know, seeing your sister as your equal and not just your little sis anymore. I think both of us bring to the table very similar characteristics in terms of being proactive and being self-driven. You know, having the reins passed to me almost felt like it's time to reclaim that again, to reclaim that older sister title, and also in a sense reclaiming this the role of being not only auntie but actually second mum, which I never thought to place myself in that position. I always thought I'm just going to be the auntie, you know, deal with Nola and then pass her back. But then actually, you know, having conversations with Cass to be, hey, you know, would you like to be her legal guardian? Would you like to, you know, play a certain role in her life? It's actually, you know, I'm actually going to be really responsible for her, and really, really responsible for her life and her upbringing. And so when I look at our artwork, it was like a foresight or a little taste of what's to come, and having this growing belly just stare at me thinking, yeah, you know what's coming. I'm coming. So that's how I felt during the creation of the piece. And to see it now on opening night last week, and to actually have Nola there, the three of us, it was really beautiful, because, you know, we now call her our little co-creator in a sense. And Crossing Threads it was never always just about the two of us. It was always an amalgamation of the people in our circle, our partners, our family. And this is just another demonstration of I guess intergenerational co-creation. So
yeah, and I guess just to add on the back of that, sis, I think the dynamic shifted incredibly, because we had now something to talk about that wasn't crossing threads, and it meant that the quality time that we were together was actually you know, more genuine and authentic, because we had an essence that was bigger than the work itself, and both of us. So I think this definitely marks a second chapter for our art practice. And trust me, once I get the time to physically get back at the loom after, you know, the first couple of years with Nola, I definitely want to explore that more within our relationship as sisters, as well as in our practice.
Great, thank you. That was unreal. It's not so much of a question as a more, I guess, a statement. I did find for Julia, I guess, the subject matter of your work to be quite fascinating within my own kind of interest, of being, I guess, critical of female representation in like the old masters of painters, of like, you know, from modernism to postmodernism. What sparked that interest for you, I guess? I mean, I guess going to any kind of art school, that's always going to happen. But what made you decide to actually create a work off that? What really kind of led that drive?
I love painting, and this is the same thing I come up against. Like, I think whatever you love, like any medium, it kind of the same issue carries across all mediums. Like, you love cinema, you love painting, you love music, you try and engage with it in this loving. I think I had a moment very recently where I picked up a box of books from my parents were cleaning out their storage, and it was from when I was in high school, and I was appalled when I'd opened it up. I must have put it in there as an 18-year-old. The only book out of probably 100 books that was written by a woman was Frankenstein. And that was my whole education. And I think like it's difficult to form any relationship with the history of kind of any art form without continually encountering these like, like, oh, I love this story except for that part where, like, I love this story except, like, there's always a caveat. And I think the only way for me to kind of, and I think like when you have any kind of like nexus of identities that aren't just like straight white male, like the only way to engage with like particularly like Western art, film, cinema is through that critical lens. So it definitely comes from a place of like a genuine love of painting and a real interest in the history of painting. And I guess, yeah, being able to like dually be like, wow, that's a beautiful composition. I really wish it wasn't off that. And like, trying to find ways of truly engaging, but remaining critical.
I have a question for Sarah.
Yeah.
So seeing like the slideshow go through, I haven't been able to like see the show in person, unfortunately, but seeing the slideshow and like seeing the images that you sent through, like it's such a beautiful, colorful show. Can you maybe speak to whether that was intentional or if it just like was a coincidence that everyone's work was like very brightly colored?
I mean, it was a little bit of a coincidence, but I think I was personally just drawn to it aesthetically. But also I like that there's this kind of clash of colors. Like I think it really kind of shows everyone's, approach to the medium, but also this like rich, bold history that everyone's really engaging with. Thank you for doing the slideshow, Kellyanne. I'm just having a look at what you guys are seeing. So I think it really it kind of has that oomph. It has that powerful, that real like feminine, just like in a way, it's like for me, like a protest or something along those lines. Like it's like, we're here, you can see us, and really engages with that. In regards to the wall colors, the indigo color that you can see on the screen is actually reference to the significance of indigo throughout textile history, not only as a dyeing quality, but also that it used to be often linked with the slave trade, and a lot of women, but also people more generally, were often traded for indigo dye, and it became a commodity. So humans were commodified for indigo. So I thought I also wanted to really acknowledge that textiles has had, a very lengthy history, and kind of engage with that and create something positive out of it and really reclaim that. And there are so many works that we didn't get the chance to talk to about today. So if you can, please come and see the show. But yeah, I think also like the color behind Nadia's work that you can see on the screen is very much linked to that idea of revolt. So Nadia's work often engages with the Venezuelan, the civil strife and the tensions that often occur there, because that's where she is from and her heritage is. And so that red is really much about protest, and the text that is behind it is basically translates to of what we are, so of what we're made of. So acknowledging that a lot of the experiences and histories that we have really do shape who we become and how we identify with ourselves and each other. I don't know if that answered your question. But yeah, no, I just love how colorful this show is. And I think it also kind of brings it into that kind of space between fine art and craft. And I think it, it makes, and like, I think you can see on the screen there, like Kate Just's work, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. Unfortunately, her dog passed away this morning, so she wasn't quite feeling up to talking, but she sends her regards. You can see in her works as well, which are these knitted works that are documenting moments in art history. So for example, like the top work is of Pussy Riot staunching a cathedral in Russia, which is like a feminist group, and as well as that work there, which is also an acknowledgement of Pussy Riot. And I think the color really kind of creates that provocative aspect of it. Yeah, got that punchy element. Yeah. Did anyone else have any other questions? No? No? Oh, did someone have a question? No.
Oh, I was just going to ask you, Sarah. You did such a beautiful job of putting together such a wonderful array of practices on how you approached, finding and choosing all of the artists that you have chosen to work with.
I'm sorry, I think it just went a bit glitchy. I didn't quite hear that end bit. Could you?
Oh, I was just asking about your approach of putting together the artists that you've chosen and how you thought about how you thought about putting the show together. I think it's a really beautiful array of artists, and I was really delighted to be alongside everyone else. So,
thank you. I think when I was looking at this show, I really wanted to look at how contemporary female artists were engaging with textiles, and specifically those who were activating a medium in a way that acknowledges where it's come from. And I think that kind of resonates with a lot of the works here. And looking at artists who have engaged with that idea of intergenerational passing of knowledge, and whether that's more of a family thing, so from mother to daughter or grandmother, sisters, that kind of more direct passing of knowledge, or whether it was through this art history knowledge, which is where your work would more lie, is looking at the artists that have come before us as well, and how that knowledge and the things that they did have actually impacted on what we do today as creatives. And I think it's a show that's kind of developed over the last year or so, and has been, I think, kind of slowly developed through studio visits and getting to know each of you individually, and really understanding the nexus of where your practice actually comes from, and that how integral it is to who you are as artists. And I think that was probably the defining thing for me more so, is how you yourselves actually come out in these works. But I think I always wanted a variety of practices. I didn't want people who did the same thing. And I think it just shows the diversity of how the medium's being engaged with these days, and how it not only acknowledges tradition as an underpinning factor, whether aesthetically or even the techniques. A lot of these techniques are very traditional, but looking at how it actually situates within our contemporary context as well. So a lot of the themes are often very contemporary, and are very much about who we are today as we've been shaped from what has already happened. I don't know if that made any sense. Sometimes I babble on. Yeah. And I think...
Oh yeah, sorry, I was just going to ask if anyone else has any
No,
questions.
that's right. Because I'm sitting in the space, I'm looking around me, I'm getting feeding off all of the energy coming from it. But I think as well, some of the works, we had 5 commissions. We were so fortunate to be able to do that for the show. So it was kind of looking at how we could amalgamate these new commissions with older loaned works, and how they could have kind of look at that idea of transition or transience, and kind of building on the old to make the new. And a lot of the works are also very spatially engaged. So a lot of them either hang from the roof, or as you can see, we've got the suspended works are there as well, but also looking at photography and things that have engaged with textiles more as like an attribute rather than it actually being the actual work itself. So really looking at how the medium itself and the materiality of it was engaged with differently by all the different artists. Okay, I'm going to shush now.
That was great.
That's great. That was really, really great. Does anyone else have any questions they would like to send through the chat, or any of the artists want to say any final last words before we close off this webinar? Carmel has raised her hand. She's one of our attendees. She's also the coordinator here as well. Carmel, do you want to actually talk? I can put you on audio if you'd like. I think she's put something in the chat. Hang on, I can hear her talking upstairs. Give me a second. Carmel?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear you now? So I put you through.
Yeah, look, I just want to, this can be a question anyone can answer, but I just want to know how much does kind of, you know, the history of feminism and female artists actually, I mean, in terms of, you know, I can see some works speak directly to kind of the history of kind of women in art, certainly in one particular work, but in terms of the role of women and feminism in women have been seen not only as object but as creators. Or doesn't it really, you know, it's not really an issue anymore, do you think? You know, I'm thinking about the works from you know, from the 1960s and 70s, and just re-looking and re-examining kind of, you know, more traditional roles of women and the kinds of you know, materials and works, you know, they were pretty much hidden. I mean, how, you know, does any of your work kind of all speak to that or address that in any way? Or Sarah, do you have anything that you might want to say about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think like there is a feminist twist to the entire show. I think it really acknowledges you know, that heritage and that history and those experiences that have occurred. You know, Kate Just's work is very much about feminism and really looks at moments in not only history but how art history has responded to those. And she kind of depicts it through knitting as a way of softening it and making it more engaging, and not, it's still provocative, but it isn't confronting that people don't want to engage with it. So she's kind of trying to make it more accessible. But the works that we have, we've only got 3 of a very large series of works that has happened over the last few years, which each kind of build up this lineage of, you know, feminist artists that have come before as a way, and she kind of looks at it as like they paved the way for me to be able to do what I do as an artist. And they, you know, they pushed the practice, they pushed the art canon, they kind of made craft as well, like, really acknowledging how craft itself has become more accepted as a fine art medium because a lot of practitioners pushed for it and fought for it. And then like, Julie, you probably can speak a bit more to your work and how it relates to like feminism as like a stance against, against like the patriarchal kind of male gaze. But I think, you know, this is an all-female lineup, so it is really kind of engaging with that feminist history, but also writing it at the same time.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, that's a political kind of decision right from the beginning, isn't it? Really, you know, choosing to have women and fibre, and the fact that they all work with textiles in some shape or form, either directly or indirectly, don't you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I think, you know, textiles has always had this association with craft and like that kind of like handicraft domestic space. and something that women did, whilst, watching after the kids or cooking. Like, it was very much had associations with that. And I think over time, it has been activated as a medium within itself, and it has importance and value. So I think this show is kind of like a survey of that, and looking at how contemporary women have, reclaimed it as a medium that has importance and significance, and use it as their way of communicating their histories and their stories. And
equally it becomes a vehicle for empowerment as well.
Absolutely. Did any of the artists want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I wanted to add that, the fabrics that I was working with that were put together by my aunt and my grandmother. I've chosen specifically to work with them because they're even without all of the adornments that I added to them, they're incredibly beautiful and very craft. But I feel that there's no way that I alone could have done something on this scale without their contributions first. And so I think I might have mentioned, but I see this work as a collaboration between me, my grandmother, and my aunt. And so I think there's definitely been a shift in the value that we give to these art forms. And I think that my work kind of speaks to that, because in the past it wouldn't have been considered as a fine art. It was things that they were making into blankets and pillows and things. So I think my work definitely works to kind of speak to that idea of feminism. And
Can I tack on to what you just said as well, Linda? I think a lot of this conversation around craft and art and women's work becomes a conversation about labor and whose labor we're kind of crediting, and the same kind of object positionality of showing in an exhibition are also being made by so many other women that are not being acknowledged or looked at. And I think that's something I think about when I'm unpicking clothes a lot of the time. I'm looking at these beautiful, careful. I have no idea who she is because she made these clothes, or not distinctly a woman, but likely a woman. And recognizing the art and the craft that's sort of inherent in all objects all around us, and kind of whose labor we're celebrating and whose labor we're looking at.
Yeah, can I jump on that too, Julia? I think this the conversation of craft and labor is definitely profound, especially I guess in the orbit that Cass and I have been operating in. When you think of fibre art and the intersection between craft and fine art, when does one piece of textile art be regarded as craft versus fine art because it's displayed or exhibited in exhibition with other artists? That has definitely crossed our minds, and it's somewhat a question back to us and the provenance of where our materials are from, the motivations about what are we even creating, and even that comparison of our artistry or craftsmanship versus hundreds of other female artisans around the world who delve in weaving, who make homewares, who weave rugs. There's a plethora of many, and hundreds and hundreds of women who are equally capable and who deserves the exposure or limelight to say, hey, this piece of textile art is different to this rug, even though from a methodological standpoint, the rug might be even more intricate and more laborsome and more technical. And I'm somewhat more amazed about looking at a rug than looking at a textile art found in a contemporary art space. as us as makers, do we have that privy and knowledge to actually respond to art and take in art based on that, not necessarily based on the concept or the story behind the art? I still find greater resonance in the artistry and technique of the weaver or the maker. I think also in this digital world, especially COVID, there has been definitely a resurgence of the handmade, whether that is the time more spent at home to attend to hobbies that you once, ignored, or actually finding, new possibility in creating new things or going down an entrepreneurship. And this is not to say to capitalize on hobbies. I think that's another conversation to have, but to see the rise of the appreciation of the handmade in such a digital, fast-paced world, that is something to be acknowledged, I think. I think people are becoming more in tune to the familiarity of textile. We wear it every day, we use it every day, but to see that there are people, or women in this space, who are grasping that sense of agency to make something of it and to make it, is that your chosen medium in your art practice? And if that leads you to a space where you can actually succeed and, make it become part of your livelihood, is that new sense of agency something to celebrate in this world? Then the fibre artists who came before us, who didn't have that exposure. I'm just talking out loud.
No, that's great. It's great. Actually, on that kind of line though, so Jane has put in the chat, so I hope you don't mind me reading this out, Jane. The seams of our clothes are the places of the most intensity in the whole clothes making processes. And we don't necessarily know who sewed these seams, probably women in dire circumstances. There is a whole other story contained in the seams. That was quite great. So right. I mean, does anyone want to speak to that specifically?
Maybe I was just going to quickly add something to the whole conversation in terms of us. Before I comment on this idea from Jane, I think a lot about reclaiming both materials, preferably, I guess, in general, secondhand recycling, reclaiming materials that have prior histories. That's what I'm interested in, as same as some of you also are, and also reclaiming this labor, this knowledge, these unvoiced, mostly women, that also the ones that influenced us personally, but in general, history of unvoiced makers and artists. And I also would like to comment on Jane's thoughts about the seams and the labor, I guess, and reflecting on the labor behind our clothes and textiles. What you wrote, it really reminds me of what my mom always used to say, that only someone who actually does sew and makes clothes knows what it means to actually make, wearable textiles and all that. Like, the person that can make that knows what it means. Difficult to that person to just throw away clothes and just I guess be as unaware of the labor and the cost and the value, I guess, behind clothes, as it the rest of society could I guess be, I guess it's less aware of all that. So that's these thoughts really resonate with that, I guess, knowledge that stuck with me. So
I guess it also just makes me think of like the term handmade, especially when we're looking at things that are sold as art or craft, when, even when things are made in a factory, they're still handmade. It's just like, whose hands are we talking about? And I think there's like a lot of really interesting conversations to be had about the way that we think about like everyone involved in making everything that we engage with. And again, and like Monica said, the respect that we have for things when we acknowledge that they're made by people.
Greatly said, Julia. I guess on that note, we've hit 2:30. So as great as it would be to carry on this conversation, I guess we'll actually say we'll just end the webinar on that note. Please, whoever's watching, do come through to see the show. It is open until the 12th of February. SCMG will be closed during the Christmas break, closing on the 22nd and then reopening to the public on the 11th. But before then and after then, please do come to actually see the show. It's beautiful to see the images on the screen, but it is even better to see it in person and see the magnitude of these works as well. It's a quiet space, but it's so loud and so lively. So well done to Sarah for curating a beautiful show. And thank you to all the artists as well for wanting to be part of the show as well. We feel really honored to have your works in this space. So yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you Sarah, Linda, Julia, Monica, Lauren and Cass, and also baby Noah as well. This webinar has been recorded, and it's recording right now. And for those who would love to revisit this again, will be uploaded on our YouTube channel very, very shortly. So yeah, thank you again, and hopefully see you through our space as well. Stay safe and well, and yeah, that's it. Alrighty.